a 25% tariff on all cars that are not made in the United States. If they're made in the United States, there's absolutely no tariff.
More than 4 years, the automaker CEO seeming to break ranks with much of corporate America right now, delivering some harsh words about President Trump's tariff plan.
It started as a whisper in Detroit. A quiet concern passed from engineer to plant manager, from floor supervisor to union rep. And then, like a thunderclap, it hit. Ford Motor Company, arguably the heartbeat of American automotive history, announced that several of its major US factories were halting operations. Entire assembly lines were shutting down. Workers were told to go home. Some would be back, many wouldn't. But this wasn't the result of a foreign takeover or a recession. It wasn't even because consumers had stopped buying. The blow had come from within, from a policy crafted not in Beijing or Berlin, but in Washington, D.C. The policy? A sweeping 25% tariff on imported vehicles and auto parts, imposed under former President Donald Trump's America First doctrine. The goal was to bring back manufacturing jobs, reduce foreign dependency, and boost domestic production. The outcome, however, was something else entirely. Real quick, if you're into videos that cut through the noise and break things down clearly, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people find this. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. We've got more deep dives coming your way. Also, drop a comment and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your take. Now onto the video. Instead of reviving the auto sector, the tariffs triggered a chain reaction of factory closures, skyrocketing production costs, and a brutal hit to consumer pricing. Ford, a company that builds nearly 80% of its vehicles in the United States, found itself hemorrhaging money and forced into a corner. Its very identity as an American manufacturer wasn't enough to shield it from the aftershocks of tariff-driven inflation and broken supply chains. On May 17th, Ford made it official. The iconic Chicago assembly plant, where the Ford Explorer and Lincoln Aviator once rolled out in record numbers, would fall silent. Not long after, the Michigan assembly plant followed suit, leaving thousands of workers across 2 states without paychecks, without timelines, and without answers. This wasn't a strategic reorganization. It was a forced retreat. The company's executives cited one central cause: tariffs. While the political rhetoric touted economic independence, the practical outcome was far more sobering: a collapse in profitability, disruption in parts flow, and massive instability in the automotive labour market. And Ford wasn't alone. The American auto industry is a delicately balanced machine. It thrives on transnational cooperation, just-in-time logistics, and competitive pricing in a global marketplace. A single shift in policy, particularly one as blunt as a 25% tariff, reverberates through the system like a tremor. That tremor became an earthquake. Across the Midwest and beyond, factories paused, layoffs surged, and entire communities braced for economic fallout. What began as a political maneuver had now turned into an industrial unraveling. And the question on everyone's mind, from factory floor to corporate suite to Wall Street analyst, was simple, haunting, and unanswered. Was this really what America First was supposed to look like? May 17, 2025. It's a date that now lives in infamy inside Ford Motor Company, and it may one day be remembered as the moment the modern American auto industry began to unravel. That morning, Ford issued a press release that sent shockwaves through the nation. Several of its most iconic US assembly plants were shutting down indefinitely. This wasn't a controlled downsizing or a slow fade-out due to electric vehicle transition. It was sudden. It was massive. And it was directly tied to Washington's 25% import tariff policy. The Chicago assembly plant, a historic production hub that rolled out the Ford Explorer and Lincoln Aviator for decades, went dark. Michigan Assembly, home to the rugged Bronco and popular Ford Ranger, halted its lines. Thousands of workers were told to stand down and await further instructions. Some would receive partial pay, many wouldn't. And no one knew when, or if, they'd return to work. Ford's leadership didn't dance around the cause. In a rare moment of corporate candor, executives admitted that the driving factor behind the shutdowns was the escalating cost of doing business in the new tariff environment. What was meant to pressure China, Mexico, and other trade partners into better deals had instead struck directly at the heart of domestic production. In their financial guidance for the year, Ford dropped a bombshell. The company expected a direct earnings hit of over $1.5 billion in 2025 alone, stemming almost entirely from tariff-related cost increases. This wasn't just a stumble, it was a gut punch to a company that has weathered everything from oil shocks to the 2008 financial crisis. Desperate to stabilize, Ford initiated emergency measures almost overnight. The company raised prices across multiple models built outside the US, including the Mustang Mach-E, Bronco Sport, and Maverick, all manufactured in Mexico. The increase? Nearly $2,000 per vehicle. It was a bold move aimed at passing the tariff costs onto consumers, but it came with a price of its own. Dealers across the country reported immediate pushback. Sales began to slow. Inventory moved sluggishly. And to make matters worse, the actual flow of vehicles to dealerships was beginning to falter as well. With factories idled and parts delayed due to customs bottlenecks and increased inspection protocols, the cars simply weren't arriving fast enough to meet demand. The issues didn't stop there. The Lincoln Nautilus, a luxury SUV assembled in China and once considered a competitive player in its class, suddenly became economically unsellable. With a 25% tariff slapped onto every imported unit, the showroom price skyrocketed. Ford made a painful but necessary call: halt imports of the Nautilus altogether and exit the Chinese export market temporarily. This decision may have avoided further financial bleeding, but it also meant sacrificing access to one of the largest and fastest-growing auto markets in the world. Losing China as a buyer was a blow that few American manufacturers can afford. As panic began to creep into the investor community, Ford executives scrambled to reassure shareholders. Behind closed doors, the company began slashing its internal forecasts and trimming future product launch budgets. Rumors circulated that R&D investments might be scaled back, delaying the development of next-gen vehicles. It became clear that Ford was no longer playing offense. It was fighting to survive. The silence from Washington was telling. While Ford hemorrhaged money, laid off workers, and pulled out of key markets, the Trump administration showed no signs of retreat. The White House held firm that the tariffs were necessary and that short-term pain would eventually yield long-term American prosperity. But inside Ford's boardrooms, on the factory floor, and in dealerships across the country, there was growing skepticism. How long could the bleeding continue before the damage became permanent? What had begun as an effort to bring jobs home had resulted in thousands being sent home indefinitely. For Ford, the shutdowns weren't just a temporary adjustment. They were a warning shot to the entire industry. No company, no matter how American, how historic, or how resilient, was safe from the unintended consequences of a trade war fought on shifting economic ground. And as the company braced for more turbulence, one truth was becoming impossible to ignore. If Ford was falling, others would soon follow. Ford's shutdown was just the beginning. What followed was a domino effect that swept through the entire American auto industry like a tsunami, swift, destructive, and impossible to ignore. Within days of Ford's announcement, the tremors reached General Motors, Stellantis, and a long list of Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers across the Midwest and beyond. The ripple had become a quake. General Motors, already facing its own internal pressures to shift toward electric vehicles, had no choice but to adjust. It paused certain operations, including parts of its truck assembly lines. The Fort Wayne truck plant, a key facility where Chevrolet Silverado and GMC Sierra pickups are built, saw a sudden shift in priorities. GM rushed to bring more production back on shore, even adding a new shift and hiring 200 temporary workers in an effort to localize more of its manufacturing. But this was a patch, not a solution. Behind the scenes, executives admitted they were simply trying to buy time. Stellantis, the parent company of Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, and Ram, was also caught in the crosshairs. It idled multiple plants in Canada and Mexico as cross-border tariffs drove up component costs. Nearly 900 workers at component plants in Indiana and Michigan were laid off virtually overnight. For these employees, it wasn't just about a paycheck, it was about food on the table, health insurance for their kids, and mortgage payments they could no longer make. As production lines stalled, the effects began to cascade into every corner of the supply chain. Companies that produce everything from spark plugs to infotainment systems found themselves stuck. Many couldn't afford to absorb the tariff costs, nor could they raise their prices without losing contracts. A silent crisis was unfolding in the supplier network, one that threatened to bring the entire system grinding to a halt. Dealerships, meanwhile, were caught between a rock and a hard place. Inventory levels began to dry up. Popular models were no longer arriving on schedule, if at all. Customers started noticing delays, empty lots, and rising prices. April saw new car prices surge by 2.5%, the largest month-over-month increase in years. Some dealerships attempted to offer limited time deals, while others hiked prices further, anticipating continued supply issues. Ford attempted to stay ahead of the curve by offering employee pricing to all customers, a move typically reserved for extreme downturns. It was a desperate attempt to boost sales and reduce growing inventory pressure. But even this wasn't enough to reverse the damage. Logistics companies also felt the sting. With fewer vehicles being produced and shipped, freight volumes dropped. Truckers found themselves idling longer, routes were cut, and shipping delays became the norm. Ports, rail lines, and cross-border hubs began to slow down, not from congestion, but from emptiness. By the end of the quarter, it became clear. The US auto industry was not simply navigating a rough patch, it was in full-blown crisis mode. Supply chains that had taken decades to refine and optimize were now breaking apart under the pressure of geopolitical policy. The system wasn't bending, it was cracking. And for every layoff, every price hike, and every delayed shipment, there was one inescapable reality. The damage was no longer theoretical. It was now visible in unemployment reports, retail data, and Wall Street forecasts. The American auto industry, long considered one of the most efficient and resilient in the world, was being pulled apart by its own government's trade policy. And as the cracks widened, Washington remained firm in its stance. But inside factories and boardrooms across the nation, one question echoed louder with each passing day. What if this isn't a phase, but the new normal? When President Donald Trump first announced sweeping tariffs on imported cars and auto parts, the message was simple and unmistakably patriotic. Bring jobs back to America. In theory, it was a rallying cry for domestic revival. In practice, it became a policy that blindsided the very companies it aimed to protect. The 25% tariff, imposed on all imported vehicles and components, was positioned as a tool to punish foreign manipulation, especially by countries like China and Mexico. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that the first casualties weren't overseas competitors. They were American manufacturers, workers, and consumers. When asked about Ford's mass layoffs and plant closures, Trump didn't flinch. They should have brought production back a long time ago, he said, brushing aside the $1.5 billion hit Ford had just reported. In the eyes of the administration, this was growing pain. In the eyes of the industry, it was a policy-induced hemorrhage. CEOs across the automotive landscape watched the president's response with disbelief. If Ford, a brand practically synonymous with American manufacturing, could be dismissed so easily, what chance did smaller players or suppliers stand? The chill that ran through boardrooms was palpable. Quietly, some began to plan contingency exits. Others froze hiring or cancelled factory upgrades. Nobody wanted to be next in the crosshairs. But perhaps the most visible sign of stress came from the United Auto Workers. For the first time in years, union leaders publicly criticised not just company decisions, but national policy. They warned that the tariff strategy was creating instability that workers could not withstand. And their fears weren't unfounded. Layoffs were increasing, and worker morale was plummeting. Automakers tried to respond. Ford slashed prices where possible, offered desperate deals to customers, and quietly cancelled the launch of multiple models that had been in the development pipeline. GM halted expansion plans in the Midwest. Stellantis cancelled supplier contracts altogether in certain border zones. R&D departments across the industry saw budgets frozen. Engineers working on next-gen electric vehicles were reassigned to cost control or idle project work. Factory managers, many of whom had never seen a shutdown in decades of service, were told to slow output and brace for more disruptions. Even overseas partners began questioning their place in the American market. Joint ventures with Korean and Japanese companies hit a wall. Suppliers in Europe warned that if US demand continued to drop, they would shift focus elsewhere. The reputation of the United States as a stable industrial partner was beginning to fray. Yet the Trump administration stood firm. "This is about fairness," Trump repeated in multiple press conferences. "We're finally leveling the playing field." But behind closed doors, the auto industry wasn't buying it. The numbers weren't improving. Sales were tanking. Stock prices of major manufacturers slid, and the once bullish forecast for America's manufacturing comeback had dimmed into a warning. What started as a trade tactic had evolved into an ideological war, one where the government and the industries it claimed to defend were now on opposite sides of the battlefield. And in the middle of it all were the workers, watching both sides and wondering if anyone was really fighting for them. The headlines focused on corporate earnings and factory shutdowns. But on the ground, in the towns and cities that powered the American auto industry for over a century, the crisis took on a different shape. It wasn't about billions in lost revenue. It was about everyday people losing their livelihoods, their healthcare, and their hope. So, was it worth it? That's the question echoing through empty factories, quiet showrooms, and towns where the rhythm of life used to revolve around shift changes and assembly lines. What began as a bold promise to rebuild American industry now looks more like a self-inflicted wound, one that's bleeding out workers, suppliers, and global credibility. Ford isn't gone. Not yet. But it's staggering. And it's not alone. The dream of economic independence is noble. But when the cost is paid by those who can least afford it, by families, by communities, by the very people these policies claim to protect, then maybe it's time we reconsider how we define winning. Because if this is what victory looks like, we need to ask ourselves, who really lost? Once again, thanks for watching this video. If you got something out of this, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. And hey, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Agree, disagree, or something in between. I'd love to hear it.